Luke Perry was not just a chef in San Francisco. He was an institution. On foggy nights when the city lights glowed like scattered candles in the mist, people lined up along Valencia Street for a chance to eat at his restaurant called Graft. The name alone had become shorthand for innovation and obsessive detail, a place where reservations took months to secure. Diners spoke in hushed tones as plates arrived at candlelit tables, intricate arrangements of color and flavor that seemed to hold secrets. Yet the kitchen itself was not glamorous. It was hot and cramped, full of steam, and shouted orders where every second counted. Luke thrived in that chaos. He was tall, broad-shouldered with dark hair pulled back, and eyes that never missed anything. He was known for his quick temper, but also for mentoring young cooks who worshipped him. By 2007, he had earned a second Michelin star, a rare honor that seemed to guarantee his place among the greats. It was the sort of thing that should have brought security and pride, but for Luke it seemed to bring only a deeper exhaustion. On the night of the second star celebration, Graft was a study in curated perfection. The dining room was bathed in golden light reflected off exposed brick and polished concrete. Servers moved with the grace of dancers anticipating needs before anyone spoke. At the bar, couples shared cocktails infused with rosemary and smoke, casting glances at the open kitchen where Luke commanded his team like a conductor. Outside, the San Francisco fog was thick, swallowing the streetlights and muffling the city's usual clamor. But inside Graft, it was a different world. Plates of seared duck with blackberry gastrique left the pass in steady rhythm. The wait list was months long, but everyone who got in felt lucky. That night was supposed to be a victory lap, the culmination of years of back-breaking work and ambition. Staff wore crisp new aprons. The wine list had been expanded to include rare burgundies. Everyone expected speeches and toasts well into the night. Instead, Luke vanished. In the middle of service with the dining room at capacity and the pass lined with steaming plates, he simply walked out. One moment he was checking the temperature of a sauce with that practiced swirl of the spoon. The next he was gone. Staff remembered the moment only in fragments. The sous chef shouted for him. The hostess checked the alley. They thought he might have gone out for air. When he did not return, confusion turned to panic. Guests murmured as service slowed. The line cooks worked in silence, glancing at each other with questions they could not voice. Jenny Wu, the sous chef, tried to steady the team, but she kept looking at the door. They finished service in a stunned haze, plating the last desserts like machines. The night's triumph curdled into fear. The CCTV footage, later reviewed by police, showed Luke leaving by the back door. He wore his white sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He stopped under the yellow bulb over the alley, lit a cigarette, and seemed to read something. Then he tucked it away, walked out of frame, and was gone forever. There was no sign of struggle. No car picked him up. No calls were made from his phone after that moment. It was as if he had stepped off the edge of the city. The footage would become the last confirmed sighting of him. Police scoured the alley, finding only a crushed cigarette butt and boot prints that quickly merged with hundreds of others in the damp grime. Within hours, rumors spread. Staff and guests whispered versions of what they had seen. Some said he had looked sick that week, shadows under his eyes, hands trembling slightly at the pass. Others claimed he had been on edge for days, snapping at vendors on the phone. There were stories of a man in a dark coat seen at the bar, asking for Luke by name. Police followed these leads, but they went nowhere. The restaurant's owners declined comment, saying only that they were cooperating with the investigation. Reporters clustered outside the entrance for days, shouting questions at departing staff. The Graft logo, once a mark of prestige, became a symbol of unanswered questions. The Michelin Guide refused to strip the stars, citing insufficient evidence of wrongdoing, but critics wrote scathing op-eds about the industry's silence. Days turned into weeks. Luke's apartment in the Mission was searched thoroughly. It was pristine bed, made tight as a hotel room refrigerator, full nothing out of place. His knife roll, the tool of his craft, remained at the restaurant, stored carefully in his locker. Inside the locker was a note. It read simply, "I'm sorry." There was no name, No context. Staff who read it wept, unsure whether it was a confession or a farewell. Police lifted fingerprints, but found only his. His bank records showed something stranger. That same day, he had withdrawn $60,000 in cash. The bank teller remembered his face because he was polite, even made small talk about the weather. He left with the money in a plain black duffel bag. It was never recovered. The city moved on because cities always do. Graft stayed closed for a week, then reopened under Jenny Wu's leadership. She refused all interviews about Luke maintaining a public silence that felt like betrayal to some loyalty to others. The restaurant kept its stars. Customers came back praising the renewed focus and consistency. But inside the kitchen, staff avoided saying his name. New contracts included a confidentiality clause forbidding discussion of company history. The owners insisted it was standard practice, but employees whispered it was blood money. They remembered Luke's quiet authority, the perfectionism that drove them to tears, but also made them proud. Some left the industry altogether, unable to stand the smell of garlic and seared meat without seeing his face. In the years that followed, his mother kept a single close-up of Luke in her living room framed on the mantel. She spoke of him in the present tense, refusing to hold a memorial service. For her, he was just away somewhere. She remembered him as a boy who liked drawing animals on scrap paper, who refused to kill bugs even when they invaded the house. She told anyone who would listen that he was good, just tired. She could not accept that he might have run away, abandoned the life he had built with such ferocity. The police eventually moved the case to the cold file room, joining countless other missing person cases in San Francisco. But for his family, it never went cold. They still left a light on at night in case he found his way home. In kitchens across the city, chefs swapped theories in hushed voices over post-shift drinks. Some insisted he had staged his own death to start over, maybe in Oregon or Baja. Others believed he had been taken by people he owed money to, buried in the redwoods, lost in the endless gray of the Pacific. But no body was found. No confession came. And so the restaurant industry did what it always did with inconvenient stories. It moved on, plating perfect dishes over the bloodstain. Meanwhile, the city around Graft gentrified further, with new wine bars and tech offices rising on streets once lined with murals and junkies. But the alley behind the restaurant remained the same, dim and damp, the yellow light always flickering, and somewhere in the silence was the ghost of a man in chef whites, reading something in the dark before disappearing for good. Jenny Wu had never intended to lead a restaurant. She had started as a prep cook under Luke's watchful eye, trembling as she chopped onions while he corrected her knife grip. Over the years, she had become his right hand, learning every station, mastering every sauce, until she knew the menu better than anyone. When he vanished, she was the one who locked the back door behind the police officers, her hands shaking so hard she could not turn the key on the first try. The rest of the staff lingered in the dining room, sitting on chairs meant for guests, eyes red and voices low. No one knew what to do. The owner sent flowers to Luke's mother and gave everyone a week off with pay. The kitchen was scrubbed down until the smell of bleach replaced anything that had been cooked there. When they reopened, the dining room was full again, but something essential had been hollowed out of it. Jenny did not talk about the note in the locker, though she could not forget it. It sat in an evidence bag at the station, one line in his handwriting that had once filled the chalkboard specials every day. She remembered how the police had handled it carefully, as if the ink might smear, but she could not unsee the simplicity of it. I am sorry. There were no details, no instructions, no farewell to her specifically. She lay awake at night, replaying every conversation they had in the last week, searching for a clue she might have missed. When reporters asked questions at the door, she shook her head and walked away. Staff meetings were tense. Some wanted to hold a vigil. Others wanted to forget him entirely. Contracts arrived that month with new rules about media contact and confidentiality. Most signed without reading, too tired to fight. Word spread about the money. A bank teller went on local television saying she had served Luke that day. She described him as calm, maybe a little sad, wearing his whites with the top button undone. He had asked for $60,000 in cash. She remembered because she had needed approval from her manager, and Luke had joked about it taking forever. The cash was handed over in a black duffel bag. It was never seen again. Police suggested he had planned it all. Some in the kitchen believed he had escaped to Mexico, living on the beach cooking fish over open flames for tourists. Others whispered about debts. There had been rumors about him taking silent partners to finance Graft. None of it had been proven, but the stories would not die. Staff told them over beers, after service, glancing at the door as if he might walk in and deny everything. Then there was the matter of his apartment. Police had searched it thoroughly. They had found no sign of a struggle, no blood, no forced entry. The sheets were clean, the fridge stocked, the knives polished and aligned in a magnetic strip over the counter. It was the home of a man who planned everything. But his personal mail sat unopened in a neat stack. A cooking magazine was marked with a dog-eared page about a new sauce technique. The TV remote lay on the couch as if he had meant to come back and finish watching something. Nothing suggested a man ready to vanish forever. His mother refused to believe he had planned it. She went on local news, her hair pulled back tight from her face, eyes swollen from crying, insisting her son would never run from his responsibilities. She held up pictures of him as a boy, in a soccer uniform, as a teenager grinning in his first kitchen. She begged for anyone with information to come forward. A waitress remembered something else. She recalled a night 2 days before he vanished when Luke had been arguing in a hushed voice with a man at the bar. The man was older, wearing an expensive jacket. She had not heard everything, but she remembered Luke saying enough. Police asked her to describe the man. She struggled, said he had dark hair and a gray beard, but nothing distinctive. Still, it was enough to start rumors. Staff speculated about venture capitalists and silent partners. A name kept coming up. Mark Hadley. He was a regular at Graft, a wealthy investor with a reputation for being generous to the right people and ruthless with everyone else. He had paid for private dining events, tipping lavishly and insisting on wine no one else could afford. When the police went to talk to him, they found he had left San Francisco that same week, reportedly moving to Chicago. His lawyer insisted he knew nothing about Luke's disappearance. Service at Graft changed after that. Guests still came for the food, but the staff felt brittle like glass ready to crack. Jenny kept the kitchen running with an iron will. She taught new cooks the old techniques, made them repeat the plating until it was perfect. She kept the sauces true to Luke's vision, but refused to speak his name. She told them they did not discuss history. They focused on now. Tips stayed good. Reviews praised the consistency, but regulars noticed the difference. The hush at the tables was less reverent, more cautious. The magic had become something else, something colder, a performance with the warmth drained away. The months after Luke's disappearance felt like moving through fog, thicker than anything outside the restaurant's doors. The police continued their investigation at first with determined questions and carefully logged evidence, but their visits became less frequent. Detectives sat at the bar with their notebooks interviewing staff, who gave the same tired answers over and over. Some described Luke's exhaustion in those final weeks. Others claimed he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly, even during service. No one could say where he went. The CCTV footage showed nothing beyond that quiet alley. Exit, the pale light illuminating steam from his breath as he read something in his hand. It became the last living image of him, a man who looked completely alone, even though he was surrounded by a city of millions. Jenny kept working her head down, refusing interviews or media attention. She rejected calls from journalists who wanted a quote about Luke's legacy or his so-called genius. She told staff they would not feed rumors that their job was to cook, serve, and get paid. The owners seemed to agree. They ordered new menus without his name and quietly replaced the mural in the hallway that had once shown Luke plating a dish. The staff watched these changes with discomfort, their silence both agreement and protest. In private, they speculated about what the police had missed. They remembered stories of Luke meeting with people late at night in the wine cellar. One line cook insisted he had seen a man hand Luke a stack of cash, but no one else had witnessed it, and police eventually stopped asking. Outside the kitchen, the restaurant's public face hardened into politeness that felt strained. Guests avoided mentioning Luke if they recognized Jenny. Critics wrote thoughtful reviews about the importance of separating art from artist, praising the preserved quality of the food while acknowledging the unresolved questions. Regulars whispered to each other about the possibility that he had staged his own disappearance. Some claimed they saw him in Portland or Baja, cooking in beachside shacks or working at food trucks. But nothing ever came of those rumors. The police followed tips for months, even checking with Mexican authorities, but every lead dissolved. When Jenny heard those stories, she clenched her teeth and kept chopping. She did not entertain the idea of Luke living freely, while she burned her hands on the stove to keep his reputation intact. The family did not stop looking. Luke's mother made pleas on local news broadcasts, clutching old photos in her weathered hands. She visited the restaurant once and sat at the bar until Jenny came out to see her. They spoke in hushed, awkward tones. Jenny could not offer any comfort because she had none to give. She had lost her mentor, her teacher, and in some ways the person who had given her purpose. When she went home at night, she stood in her tiny apartment kitchen lit by a single bulb and tried to recreate the sauces he had taught her, tasting them with growing frustration. They never came out the same. She wiped her eyes and turned off the stove. The apartment walls seemed to close in around her as she listened to the city traffic humming outside, indifferent to her grief. Mark Hadley's name kept coming up in late-night staff conversations. Some said he had threatened Luke over unpaid debts that he had been using the restaurant to launder money through lavish private dinners no one accounted for properly. But there was no proof. When police tracked him to Chicago, they found nothing. His lawyer said he had nothing to hide. Hadley bought a new penthouse and invested in restaurants there, moving on without a backward glance. Staff at Graft learned not to say his name aloud anymore. It felt dangerous even in whispers. The owners denied any deals with him beyond standard patronage. They said everything was above board, but their eyes flickered away when staff asked about it. Jenny knew better than to push them. She was already walking a thin line, keeping her team together. In time, the investigation simply stopped. The case file was moved to a cabinet labeled Cold, where it joined hundreds of others that had become the private tragedies of a city that claimed to care, but did not have the resources to keep trying. The detectives did not call anymore. The evidence room still held Luke's cigarette butt, his uniform from that night, the note from his locker in its clear plastic sleeve. No one was checking them. They sat there like relics of a closed chapter. When Jenny passed the police station on her way home, she sometimes looked at the glass doors and wondered if anyone inside even remembered his name. She felt the anger boil in her chest, but pushed it down because she had no time to indulge it. She had payroll to manage, produce to order, schedules to fill. The work did not care about grief. The staff adjusted because they had no choice. They cooked, they plated, they cleaned. New hires were told the basics, and nothing more. Some of the old staff left unable to deal with the memories. Others stayed because they needed the paycheck. The restaurant owners installed a new reservation system and expanded the wine list. Business improved. Tourists filled the seats, oblivious to the whispers that clung to the walls like smoke. Critics continued to grant praise, noting the remarkable consistency of the menu, even as they tiptoed around the missing chef's legacy. Jenny signed the new contracts with the confidentiality clauses and told herself it was to protect everyone, but she hated every letter of them. Graft did not close. It adapted the way a living thing does when it loses a limb, reshaping itself around the absence. Jenny oversaw every detail of the transition. She approved new linens that matched the old ones exactly, ensuring returning guests would see no change. The menu stayed almost the same. The sauces followed Luke's proportions with near religious devotion. Staff practiced plating until it matched photos in a binder kept in the office. It was supposed to reassure everyone that nothing had been lost, that the vision remained intact, even if the visionary had disappeared. Guests liked this continuity. They felt comforted by the idea that talent could vanish, and yet the experience would not falter. They told each other that the kitchen was just as good, maybe even more consistent. Reservations were still difficult to get. Behind the pass, though, the mood was different. Old staff fell quiet when they saw Jenny approach. They respected her skill, but worried about her rigidity. She had learned to be unyielding because the owners demanded it. When they asked if the menu could evolve, she shook her head. She said the city was watching them for any sign of decline. They could not afford to change anything. This obsession felt like loyalty to some, like imprisonment to others. New cooks entered with enthusiasm, but left after a few months unable to stand the tension. When they asked questions about Luke, they were told there were no answers. The confidentiality clause in their contracts became a looming threat, even if no one had ever enforced it. The kitchen grew quiet in the way a mausoleum does, filled with movements and hushed orders, but no laughter. The owners were satisfied. They bragged to investors about maintaining the Michelin stars without disruption. They offered bonuses to Jenny for hitting revenue targets. She accepted the checks without smiling. In meetings, she sat with her hands clasped, listening to them talk about expansion opportunities and private dining revenue projections. She thought of Luke's bank withdrawal, the duffel bag he had carried out the note in his locker. She said nothing. The owners had families and mortgages and a reputation to protect. They treated Luke's disappearance as an unfortunate branding challenge. They hired a PR consultant who drafted talking points about respecting his legacy while moving forward. Jenny read them once and threw them away. She refused interviews, saying only that she was focused on the food. Guests noticed little. They wrote online reviews praising the precision of the service and the harmony of the courses. They liked how the front of house never mentioned Luke. They found it tasteful. The reservation system improved. The waitlist remained robust. Tourists considered it a must-visit destination. They took selfies in front of the discreet brass plaque with the restaurant name and posted them with hashtags about fine dining. They admired the open kitchen without realizing it had become a theater of silence. Critics praised Jenny's leadership in columns that hinted at the tragedy without dwelling on it. They described the restaurant as a testament to resilience, a triumph of craft over chaos. They meant it as a compliment, but to Jenny it felt like a wound. Inside the staff room, the tone was different. The old-timers still remembered Luke's voice barking orders, but also the way he quietly corrected their mistakes. They remembered him refusing to throw out imperfect produce if it could be salvaged for family meal. They remembered the night he disappeared, and the sick realization that no one could explain it. Newer staff did not understand why the veterans watched the door at closing time, expecting something or someone. They found the atmosphere oppressive. They left with polite goodbyes, unable to articulate why it felt so wrong. Jenny let them go. She could not save them from it. She could not save herself. Once a former line cook returned to eat. He sat at the bar and watched Jenny work the pass. He said nothing until dessert, when he leaned forward and asked if she ever thought about what really happened. Jenny did not answer. She kept wiping plates and calling orders. He paid his bill, left cash for the tip, and walked out without looking back. She could not remember if she had ever seen his face again. She lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word Luke had spoken to her in the last week. She got up, turned on the stove, and made sauce until the sky turned pale. It did not taste right. She threw it out. The owners eventually replaced the staff photo wall, removing images of Luke smiling with celebrity chefs or posing with wine distributors. They claimed it was for brand consistency. They ordered staff not to discuss the past with guests. They threatened to fire anyone who broke confidentiality. Most complied. Some called it blood money. But they kept working. Rent was high. Jobs were scarce. The city cared about results, not ghosts. Jenny stopped arguing. She enforced the rules. She needed the kitchen to function. She told herself she was protecting everyone from lawsuits and gossip. She told herself Luke would have wanted it this way even if she did not believe it. Luke's family never accepted that he had simply chosen to walk away. His mother Ruth held on to her belief with stubborn determination that sometimes frightened those around her. She kept a small shrine in the living room of her modest bungalow outside Oakland. It featured framed photos of Luke in his Chef White school pictures with a crooked grin and a candle she lit every night before bed. She refused to hold a memorial service or sign any paperwork declaring him legally dead. She told anyone who would listen that a mother knows when her child is gone. She insisted she could still feel him breathing somewhere in the world, even if the police had stopped searching. When reporters called for anniversaries of the disappearance, she took their calls, reminding the public that her son was still missing. She spoke clearly, her voice only cracking when she mentioned the way he used to phone her after late shifts, just to say he was tired but safe. Family members tried to talk sense into her, gently suggesting she needed to let go for her own health. She refused. She spent hours at the kitchen table with boxes of old receipts, scraps of his menus, and police reports she had demanded copies of through formal requests. She reread every line, searching for clues the professionals had missed. Sometimes she found something she thought might matter and called the detective assigned to the case. He listened with strained politeness, explaining that there was nothing new, no new budget for cold cases like Luke's. Ruth always ended those calls by hanging up gently, staring at the silent phone, willing it to ring back. She slept lightly, always listening for a knock at the door that never came. She never moved away because she wanted him to have a home to return to. One day, nearly a year after Luke had vanished, Ruth received a postcard postmarked from Seattle. It had no return address and featured an image of the Space Needle against a gray sky. On the back were 3 words: "I am okay. No signature, no explanation." Ruth's heart thundered as she turned it over in her shaking hands. She tried to imagine his voice saying those words. She showed it to everyone. She went to the police station and handed it over. They analyzed the handwriting and called her in a week later to tell her it did not match any known samples of Luke's writing. They suggested it might be a cruel prank. She listened face blank, then left with the postcard in her purse. At home, she placed it among his things. She chose to believe it was from him, despite the expert opinion. She told herself she could hear the apology in its brevity. Jenny heard about the postcard indirectly through one of the remaining line cooks who had seen Ruth at the bus stop and spoken with her. Jenny sat in her office that night, holding her head in her hands, trying to picture Luke writing those words. She could not. She remembered his cramped block letters, the way he overused punctuation in lists on the prep sheet. She hated whoever had sent it, resenting them for offering false hope that made everything worse. Yet she could not tell Ruth that. She did not want to take even that fragile comfort from the one person who loved him without condition. She ordered the staff not to mention it in the kitchen. She wanted them focused, clean, and emotionless. But she caught them whispering in corners, and knew they would never stop wondering what had really happened. Luke's younger sister, Elena, took the search online. She created a page devoted to his disappearance. She shared photos, news clippings, and updates about the investigation, or lack of it. She posted the Seattle postcard with a message asking anyone who recognized the handwriting to come forward. She messaged hundreds of people who claimed to be psychics, investigators, or amateur sleuths. Most were useless. Some asked for money. A few offered believable theories that crumbled under scrutiny. Elena did not care. She kept trying. She organized a small fundraiser to hire a private investigator who burned through the retainer quickly and returned nothing but platitudes about how these things sometimes went cold. She called Jenny at the restaurant, once asking if Luke had mentioned any trips to Seattle. Jenny felt her chest tighten and told her no, she would have remembered. They hung up with forced politeness neither one meant. The family fractured under the strain. Holidays passed with empty chairs and forced conversation. Ruth refused to put away his stocking. She made his favorite cookies, leaving them on the counter untouched. Relatives suggested she seek counseling. She told them Luke would need her when he came back. She wanted to be the same mother he remembered, waiting with arms ready to hold him. She did not want him to think she had given up. At night, she prayed to a God she sometimes resented for answers that never came. She pictured him somewhere cold and hungry, unable to get home. She sent up her pleas into the silence and waited for something to change. She refused to leave her porch light off. The police eventually stopped taking calls from Ruth, directly redirecting her to a voicemail box for missing persons inquiries. She left messages anyway, explaining her theories in detail, sometimes crying so hard her words were unintelligible. The detective who had once taken her seriously retired. His replacement was polite but distant. When Ruth visited the station, they told her kindly but firmly that there were no new leads, that sometimes people chose to disappear. She clenched her jaw, gathered her bag, and left. She would not let them see her cry anymore. She saved her tears for the bus ride home, looking out the window at the city that had swallowed her son without remorse. By the time the 10-year anniversary approached, the story of Luke Perry had become something of a local legend in San Francisco, the kind of cautionary tale that old-timers told new line cooks after a few drinks. Newspapers that had once reported breathlessly on his sudden disappearance shifted focus over the years to other stories, newer tragedies, and brighter restaurant openings. But the San Francisco Chronicle decided to mark the anniversary with a long feature. They sent a reporter who had covered the original disappearance to interview anyone willing to talk. He sat in coffee shops with his notepad called Old Staff Members and reached out to Ruth and Elena, who agreed to speak, though it cost them sleep and peace of mind. Ruth insisted on showing the postcard again, placing it on the table between them like a relic. The reporter studied it carefully, asked if she still believed it was real. Ruth answered yes without blinking. Inside Graft, the mood around the anniversary was tense. Jenny told the staff to expect calls from reporters, but made it clear no one was to answer. She said they were cooks, not spokespeople. She canceled family meal the day the article was scheduled to run, unwilling to sit through the awkward silences or the inevitable questions. When the paper hit newsstands, the headline was restrained but pointed. A decade after the chef vanished, no answers. The article recapped the night he left the rumors of debts, the silent partner stories that had never been proven. It included a short quote from Ruth about refusing to give up hope. The owners of Graft declined to be interviewed, issuing a written statement about respecting the family's privacy and the importance of letting the kitchen speak through its work. Staff read the article anyway. They huddled over printouts in the break room, trading theories in hushed voices. Some of the older ones remembered Luke's face that night, the way he had paused before walking out. They wondered aloud if they should have followed him. The newer staff felt uncomfortable, trapped between curiosity and loyalty. Jenny heard the murmurs through the office door and felt her stomach clench. She told herself she had no time for this. She reviewed invoices, rearranged prep lists, and refused to read the article. But when she finally sat alone in her apartment, she could not resist. She read it carefully, taking in every word. She closed the paper and wept into her hands until she felt empty. In the same feature, a former line cook who asked for anonymity told the Chronicle that Luke had been in deep with the wrong people. He claimed Luke had borrowed money to open Graft, and that repayments had dried up when the restaurant struggled in its first year. He described private dining events booked at odd hours guests who never appeared on reservation logs. He said cash changed hands, that he had seen Luke arguing with a man in an expensive coat. He did not have proof. The police had closed the case years earlier after finding nothing substantial. The man refused to go on record with his name, saying he had moved out of state and wanted nothing more to do with the restaurant or San Francisco. The article ended with a quiet accusation, suggesting the truth was buried under years of silence and fear. Elena read the article and called Jenny at the restaurant. They had not spoken in months. She asked her if she had known about the debts. Jenny closed her eyes and gripped the phone tightly. She told Elena that she did not know anything for sure, that she wished she could help. Elena's voice cracked. She said their mother had spent the entire morning staring at Luke's photo. Jenny listened to the static hum between them. She wanted to apologize for so many things, but the words failed. They ended the call with stiff politeness, both ashamed of the gap that had grown between them. Jenny put the phone down and went back to work, barking orders at the line, as if nothing had happened. The owners of Graft released a brief statement after the article gained attention. They called it unfortunate that old rumors had resurfaced, dismissed the claims as unverified gossip, and reiterated their commitment to maintaining Luke's legacy through the food. They insisted the restaurant would make no further comment. Staff were reminded of their confidentiality agreements. An email went out repeating the policy in careful legal language. Some cooks rolled their eyes. Others signed without reading. Rent was still due, and jobs were scarce. Guests continued to book tables months in advance. The Chronicle article became just another folded newspaper forgotten in the bustle of dinner service. Ruth cut out the article and added it to her box of clippings. She circled the parts she thought mattered, highlighting the anonymous cook's words about debts. She showed it to Elena, who tried to convince her to let it go, to think about moving, to stop expecting Luke to walk through the door. Ruth refused. She would not change a thing. She kept the porch light on every night. She left the postcard on the mantel. She prayed that someone would come forward with real answers. She watched the door every time it rattled in the wind, refusing to believe it was just a draft. She had aged 10 years and won her hair white, and her back bent, but she held on with iron determination. It was an ordinary Thursday night service when the quiet unraveling began. The dining room was full, buzzing with polite conversation and the soft clink of polished silverware. Jenny stood at the pass, hair tied back, her voice firm as she called orders to the line. Everything ran on its usual tight schedule, each plate leaving in pristine condition. The staff moved like a machine that had been well oiled by necessity. Nothing seemed different until a server named Miguel approached the kitchen door, his face pale and uncertain. He held a small, cream-colored envelope in one shaking hand. Jenny wiped her fingers on her apron and snatched it without a word. She glanced at the handwriting. It was addressed simply to Jenny. She did not open it in front of them. She pushed through the door to the office, locked it behind her, and sat at the old metal desk. The smell of bleach and ink filled the room, a cold reminder of long nights spent in silence. She turned the envelope over twice before sliding her finger under the flap. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. She opened it carefully, her heart hammering with the kind of dread reserved for bad news that feels inevitable. The letter was not long. It did not explain everything, but it included jokes only Luke would have known, references to a sauce that had split on him once in front of a guest, the way she used to roll her eyes when he corrected her knife grip. Her throat closed up. She had to put the paper down before she crumpled it in her fist. When she finally gathered herself enough to read it through again, she saw no signature. The last line read only, "Please forgive me for everything." She sat there breathing hard, eyes watering, remembering all the times she had dreamed of him apologizing or explaining. But it felt wrong. Something in the phrasing seemed off, careful, in a way he never was. Luke had always been abrupt, even harsh, but never cautious in his words. She read the jokes again and realized they sounded rehearsed, almost like someone had repeated them back to her secondhand. She felt bile rise in her throat as she folded the paper again, hands trembling. She wanted to scream, but the walls were too thin and the staff was too close. Instead, she pressed her palm to her mouth and rocked in the chair until the nausea passed. When she emerged from the office, she kept the letter in her pocket. The staff looked at her expectantly. Miguel asked if she was okay. She told him to get back to work in a voice so sharp he flinched. The rest of service passed in a blur. Plates went out, checks were paid, guests left full and content, oblivious to the new crack forming behind the kitchen door. When the last dish was washed and the lights turned off, Jenny stayed behind alone. She spread the letter on the counter, studying the pen strokes, searching for something she could recognize. She told herself it had to be from him. Who else would know these details? But a quiet voice in her head reminded her that details can be shared, memories can be stolen. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the last real conversation they had. It felt like reaching for something at the bottom of a deep well. The next day she called Elena. Her voice shook as she told her about the letter. Elena was silent for a moment before asking if Jenny believed it was real. Jenny wanted to say yes to give her that small comfort, but she hesitated. She told Elena about the jokes, the details that felt personal, but also about the odd carefulness of the writing. Elena asked if she could see it. Jenny promised she would bring it to her. They ended the call on strained politeness, both knowing the letter would do nothing to bring peace. That night Jenny did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with the letter in front of her, reading it again and again, trying to hear Luke's voice in the words. It did not come. She felt lonelier than she had in years. The letter became a quiet storm in the restaurant. Staff whispered about it when they thought Jenny was out of earshot. Miguel confided in another server that he had found it folded into a menu, as if someone had slipped it in during the middle of service. No one remembered seeing who had done it. The reservation list for that night was full of strangers, tourists, regulars who kept their heads down over their plates. The owners heard about it within days. They called Jenny into a meeting. She sat stiffly while they asked questions in careful, legal tones. They worried about liability, bad press, anything that might disrupt the steady flow of reservations. She told them it was none of their business and walked out before they could threaten her with the confidentiality clause. She felt her heart pounding as she slammed the door behind her. Shaking with rage, she had no time to process. Outside the restaurant, the city barely noticed. The Chronicle heard rumors and called for comment. Jenny did not answer. The owners declined to speak. Ruth heard about the letter from Elena and asked to see it herself. Jenny brought it to her on a rainy afternoon. They sat in the dim living room with the postcard still on the mantel, the candle burning low. Ruth read the letter in silence, fingers shaking. When she finished, she pressed it to her chest and began to sob. Jenny sat with her staring at the floor, hating herself for bringing it, for hoping it would help, for knowing it only made everything worse. Jenny could not let the letter go. She kept it folded in her pocket during service, the paper softening at the creases with every shift. When the staff noticed her touching it, they lowered their voices, working faster to avoid her sudden, sharp commands. She began spending long nights in the office after close reviewing invoices and old bookings that made her stomach turn. She found records for private events she had barely remembered, with large payments noted only as consulting fees. The names attached seemed like nonsense strings of letters that led nowhere. She stared at the numbers until her eyes watered. She had suspected the restaurant had secrets, but the realization made her feel cold all over. She remembered Luke's eyes when he looked at her the last time, something unreadable there that she had dismissed as exhaustion. She finally made an appointment with a lawyer in a nondescript office downtown. She sat in the uncomfortable chair across from him and unfolded the letter on the polished desk. He read it without expression and asked her questions in that precise, careful tone lawyers have. She told him about the private events, the consulting fees, the fights with that wealthy investor Mark Hadley. She confessed she had never asked enough questions. She described the confidentiality agreements staff had been forced to sign, the clauses forbidding them to talk about Luke. She realized how much she had accepted in silence, too afraid to lose her position. The lawyer leaned back and tapped his pen on the letter. He told her quietly that if she wanted to walk away clean, she would have to talk to someone else first. Jenny met with the police in a small interview room that smelled of stale coffee. She sat under buzzing fluorescent lights and tried to keep her voice steady. She handed over the letter, sliding it across the table with fingers that trembled despite her best efforts. The detective on the other side read it twice before asking her when she had received it. She told him about the menu, Miguel's pale face, the hush that fell over the dining room. She admitted she had kept it for days before coming forward. She explained about the bookings and the strange payments, her voice catching, as she described her fear that Luke had been forced to launder money through his own restaurant. She looked at the detective's impassive face and felt anger rising in her throat, realizing that he had heard stories like this too many times to react. The detective asked if she believed Luke had written the letter himself. Jenny shook her head slowly. She said it felt like someone pretending to be him, someone who knew enough about the kitchen and their private jokes to make it convincing. But it was careful. Too careful. She remembered Luke scrawling notes on prep lists in shorthand no one else could read, shouting corrections over the roar of the vent hoods. He had never been careful with his words. She felt tears threaten, but forced them back, breathing deep until her chest hurt. The detective asked if she thought he had been planning to leave her clues. She swallowed hard and said she did not know. The silence in the room stretched on uncomfortably. The police reopened the case. Quietly, without press releases or announcements, they began to examine old evidence. They reviewed financial records Jenny had flagged. They called in staff who had worked those private events and asked questions that made them sweat. Some admitted seeing envelopes change hands heavy with cash. Others claimed ignorance too afraid to lose their current jobs to admit anything at all. The shell companies that had received the consulting fees turned out to be registered in Nevada with no real offices or staff. The detective followed the paper trail to accounts that had gone dry years ago, empty except for old statements showing transfers that stopped the week Luke disappeared. Jenny received a call one night just after closing. She stood in the back alley with her phone pressed to her ear, listening as the detective explained what they had found. They believed Luke had tried to stop the laundering, had threatened to walk away from the arrangement, and someone had decided to make sure he could not talk. Jenny pressed a hand against the cool brick wall, fighting the urge to vomit. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made it too real. She thought about the line cooks who had stayed silent, the owners who had insisted on confidentiality. She felt something snap inside her that she knew could never be repaired. Word spread slowly among the old staff. Some called her in tears, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Others stayed silent, afraid of the consequences. The owners remained quiet, issuing no statements, leaving their lawyers to deflect questions. Bookings continued the dining room full of unaware guests who savored the same dishes Luke had once perfected. Jenny worked every shift, feeling like a ghost in her own kitchen. She trained new cooks with a voice stripped of warmth, correcting them with mechanical precision. She went home to her apartment and sat at the table in the dark, the letter laid out in front of her, reading the words over and over until they blurred. The investigation that had once been forgotten gained a new, uneasy life. Detectives began calling in people connected to Graft for interviews that lasted hours. Former line cooks sat under buzzing lights in stuffy rooms, sweating as they recounted what they remembered about late-night bookings and unrecorded payments. Some admitted seeing Luke argue with men in suits who did not look like diners, their coats draped over the backs of chairs in private rooms as cash changed hands. Others denied everything with shaky voices, their eyes darting to the door as if they wished to run. Jenny found herself at the station twice that month, sitting with her hands folded on the table, repeating the same details until she felt hoarse. She explained the consulting fees again and again, the dates that aligned with Luke's growing anxiety, the late invoices that made no sense. Forensic accountants combed through old records Jenny had saved. They traced payments to shell companies that led nowhere, real businesses with no staff or locations beyond a mailbox in Nevada. Money flowed in large, clean amounts that were impossible to justify with the number of bookings. The pattern became clear. The restaurant had served as a laundering operation for money that no one would explain. The silent partner who had signed off on it all was hard to pin down, listed under corporate names and proxy signatures, but one familiar name surfaced again and again in email threads and meeting notes: Mark Hadley. The wealthy investor who had once been such a visible presence in the dining room now lived in a different city, insulated by lawyers who spoke carefully for him. Detectives flew to Chicago interviewing Hadley with quiet intensity. His answers were smooth and practiced. He insisted he had done nothing illegal, that his role had been strictly that of a passive investor unaware of day-to-day operations. He claimed the consulting fees were normal industry practice for event planning and special wine sourcing. When asked about his relationship with Luke, his expression barely changed. He remembered Luke as difficult a creative type who hated the business side of things. He said he was shocked by the disappearance but had nothing to hide. The investigators left with more questions than answers, but they pressed on filing subpoenas for old emails and transaction logs, building a case that became a whispered topic in city hall meetings and staff lounges. Back at Graft, Jenny felt the atmosphere shift under the weight of unspoken truths. The staff tried to ignore the tension, focusing on the sear of the scallops, the reduction of sauces to glossy perfection. But they could not avoid it forever. Health inspectors showed up more frequently. Tax agents requested old payroll documents. Journalists circled the block, sniffing for a scandal that would sell papers. The owners held tense meetings in the office door, closed voices raised in muffled arguments. Jenny sometimes heard her own name mentioned, followed by silence when she knocked. She knew her decision to talk had cost her their trust forever. She told herself she did not care, but at night she lay awake in her small apartment wondering if she had destroyed the last thing she had ever felt good at. Guests continued to fill tables, unaware of anything beyond the taste of foie gras and the crispness of the wine list. They complimented the staff, posed for photos under the subtle lighting. Reviews online remained glowing, praising the consistency and elegance of the experience. But the staff worked like people haunted. Even the newest cooks sensed it. Jenny saw their nervous glances, the way they flinched when the phone rang or a clipboard appeared. She tried to keep service running, shouting orders over the roar of the hood vents, wiping plates with obsessive precision. But her voice cracked sometimes. She caught herself staring into the heat lamp, remembering Luke's hands demonstrating the perfect plating, the way he had barked at her to pay attention. In private, Jenny spoke to detectives about what she had seen in Luke's eyes during those last days. She remembered the way he had stopped mid-sentence to glance at the door, as if listening for footsteps. She remembered his hands shaking as he counted tickets. She described the argument with Hadley, the words she had overheard without understanding at the time. She told them she believed Luke had wanted out, that he had threatened to stop laundering the money. She was sure that was the trigger. The detective took notes without expression, but asked careful follow-up questions. Jenny felt both relieved and sickened that someone was finally listening. She left the station each time feeling hollowed out, clutching her bag like a shield. Rumors leaked. The Chronicle ran an article about the reopened case this time, naming the silent partner and the alleged laundering operation. The owners of Graft refused comment. Reservations dropped sharply for the first time in years. Some staff quit on the spot, too exhausted or ashamed to stay. Jenny watched them go without argument. She stayed because she felt she had to see it through. She felt responsible for every lie she had helped maintain, for every shift she had enforced silence. She watched the line shrink, the orders slow, the kitchen grow quiet. She felt no satisfaction as the walls closed in on the truth. Only the weight of it pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Jenny woke before dawn most mornings in those final weeks, sitting at the edge of her bed, listening to the distant sounds of delivery trucks on the street. She wrapped her fingers around a chipped coffee mug and waited for the sun to climb above the fog. She thought about Luke, constantly his voice barking orders across the line, the way he used to correct her grip with a single sharp tap on the wrist, his laughter in rare, quiet moments when the kitchen fell silent, except for the hiss of the burners. She remembered the first time she had heard him say her name without sounding annoyed, the smallest sign of approval that had made her work twice as hard. The memories ached like old burns on her arms that had never really healed. She felt heavy with them as she stood and dressed in the same black slacks and white coat, the uniform that had once felt like armor but now clung like a shroud. When she arrived at Graft, the quiet was suffocating. Reservations had plummeted since the latest articles. The dining room that had once been filled with polite chatter and clinking glassware now sat half-empty most nights. The staff had thinned to a skeleton crew, veterans who could not let go, and newcomers desperate for any kitchen job in the city. The owners rarely appeared in person, their voices confined to tense emails and lawyer-drafted memos. Jenny ignored them. She ran service with relentless focus, inspecting plates, correcting mistakes, with clipped instructions, refusing to let standards slip, even as it became clear the restaurant was bleeding out. She knew the reviews were changing. Critics who had once praised them with careful respect now used words like soulless and hollow, describing the dining experience as polished but joyless. She could not argue with them. She felt it too. The investigation moved slowly, but it moved. Police filed charges related to financial crimes against former management. Forensic teams dragged boxes of old invoices and hard drives from the cramped office. Jenny had once sat in the room where she had cried over the letter. Detectives asked her to identify signatures and confirm schedules, her testimony becoming one more piece of a puzzle that refused to come together cleanly. She found herself numb through most of it, answering questions with mechanical precision, watching pens move over legal pads as if they were writing the story of someone else's life. But late at night she lay awake, with the words repeating in her head. Laundering, fraud, threats. She wondered if Luke had tried to tell her if he had left that last angry glance across the pass as a warning she had been too stubborn to read. One morning she met Ruth outside the restaurant. The older woman stood on the cracked sidewalk in a plain coat, clutching a battered purse. She looked smaller than Jenny remembered her hair, a brittle gray halo, her eyes shadowed with years of loss. They did not greet each other with warmth. They stood together in the chilly wind, staring at the sign above the door that still bore the name that had once meant everything. Ruth spoke slowly, asking if Jenny thought Luke had known what would happen. Jenny swallowed before answering. She said she believed he had realized too late that he was in too deep, that he had tried to stop it but had been trapped. Ruth listened with a blank face, but her fingers twisted the purse strap until the leather creaked. She finally asked the question that had haunted them both for years. Did Jenny think he had been afraid? Jenny closed her eyes, feeling the tears build, and nodded once before she could stop herself. Ruth turned away then, walking down the street without another word, her shoulders hunched against the wind. Weeks later, detectives found a shallow grave in Mendocino County. A hunter had stumbled on disturbed earth, something white and curved poking through the moss. Dental records confirmed the remains were Luke's. There was no drama in the announcement, no press conference. Jenny got the call at home, sitting in the dark with a bottle of wine she had not even opened. She listened to the detective's calm explanation, feeling something inside her collapse like a structure with rotten beams. She did not cry at first. She only thanked him in a strangled voice before hanging up and pressing her forehead to the table. When the tears finally came, they felt endless. She felt every moment of anger she had swallowed, every order she had barked to keep the kitchen running, every night she had lied to herself that they were honoring his memory by refusing to speak about him. The funeral was small. Ruth chose a modest cemetery near Oakland where she could visit easily. She wore black with no jewelry, her hair pinned back neatly. Elena stood beside her, older and more tired but resolute. Jenny attended, but stayed at the back, hands folded, watching the ceremony through a blur of tears. She listened to the pastor's words about forgiveness and the cruelty of unanswered questions. She listened to Ruth's voice cracking as she read a short letter she had written to her son, telling him she hoped he had not been cold or alone at the end. Jenny felt something break inside her when she heard that. She remembered Luke's last text to the staff about the weather turning bad, and cutting the hike short, those spare words that sounded the same as the lie in the postcard. I am okay. It felt like the cruelest thing of all that someone had made him say it. After the burial, Jenny approached the grave slowly. The others had left to wait by the cars. She crouched and placed her hand on the disturbed earth. She whispered apologies that no one else could hear. She told him she was sorry for ignoring the signs, for enforcing the silence, for trying to preserve the reputation of something that had been corrupted beyond repair. She told him she would not forget. When she stood, she felt weaker than she ever had in her life. But she also felt something else. Resolve. She turned and walked back to the parking lot, face wet with tears, ignoring the curious glances of the few who had stayed behind to watch. Graft closed 6 months later. The owners blamed bad press and changing tastes, avoiding any mention of the investigation. The sign came down quietly one morning. Jenny did not show up to watch. She had found a new job in a smaller kitchen across the bay, cooking simpler food for people who appreciated it without needing a review to tell them it was good. She worked fewer hours, but with more care training young cooks who were still excited about the work. She did not talk about Luke much, but she did not stop remembering him. Sometimes she caught herself correcting a prep cook's grip exactly the way he had corrected hers, and she would stop mid-sentence, biting her lip hard enough to draw blood. She would step back, take a breath, and try again with more patience. Elena kept the online page alive, posting updates about the case's resolution, memorial photos, and small notes about their mother's health. Ruth visited the grave every week, leaving flowers even when the grass was wet with fog. She never declared Luke dead in her heart. She called him my son every time someone asked. She spoke of him in the present tense. She refused to let the world forget what had been done to him, even as other headlines took over other restaurants opened with bright signs and promises of perfect service. If you enjoyed this story and want more thoughtful, immersive content, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. Your feedback helps us keep creating stories that stay with you long after they end.